You know, the landscape in churches is changing. I know for myself, I grew up in a big Pentecostal church in Hamilton, and as I've gone back to that church, I've seen a different flow than it ever was when I was there before. The landscape is changing from a cultural perspective. Jeeva, you've noticed that where you are. How is it changing in churches you're familiar with?
Well, it's changing in two ways. On the one hand, you're seeing churches crop up that are exclusively one particular people group. You know, so for example, in St. Catharines, you know, where I live, we have a church that is predominantly Nigerian. But within that Nigerian, most people would look black in that congregation, but there are a number of African nations represented as well as Caribbean nations. And so they are multicultural. Also, the other church that I'm very familiar with is the Catch the Fire group of churches. And they certainly, you know, have seen, as a matter of fact, Pastor Steve Long told me that 2/3 of their members were not born in Canada.
Wow.
So they have done a great job of making sure that new Canadians feel at home in their church.
Ray, what's happening with the Catholic Church in immigration?
So the especially Asian immigration has in the major cities, and I don't know the exact numbers, but this is data that Angus Reid has collected as well. There are 18 mega churches that are either Filipino, Chinese, Vietnamese, or Chinese.
And that's over 1,000 people.
And that means that more than 1,000 are worshiping per weekend.
Wow.
And some of them are 4,000 or 5,000.
In the Catholic tradition.
In the Catholic tradition. What's interesting is many of those, as was just mentioned, are very culturally and even in terms of the language of worship, you know, focused on a single people group, which raises questions in terms of how the second and third generation are going to be integrated. So some of those churches are facing significant challenges. But many of these people are quite orthodox in their theology. They bring that with them. So it's having an impact on the Catholic Church at large in Canada as well.
Okay, so Derek, let's talk your experience with immigration, because you work and volunteer out across a number of different social services, food banks, prison care, senior care. What are you seeing about the immigration picture?
I see a lot of people, when they come in to our country, end up in the shelters. We get to see them firsthand. We get to see them and first give them the gospel. First thing that they come in our country, we see when they're in the shelter. We're there every Wednesday in all 4 shelters in Mississauga and Oakville. And once you go in and we do the chapel service, it's packed. They come in, they want to get involved in something because they're coming from different parts of the world. And these are Christians who are coming in. And not only Christians, but Hindus and Muslims. And they would attend a chapel service in the shelter. And a lot of times you'd be surprised how many of them would give their life to the Lord. And make, you know, we direct them into a church that they would want to go to.
So what's happening spiritually then in the immigration experience that they want to hear about Jesus?
I think they come from a church back in their country where they're involved. And when they get here, they want to get involved into the right church, but they don't know where to go or what church to go to. So they're depending on us to lead them into the right direction. And once they come into that place, we guide them, we direct them, we lead them to a church that, you know, they can get involved in. And you'd be amazed, my church is, you know, he mentioned Nigerian. We have more Nigerians in our church than we do anything else. And the dynamic in our church is it's just changing. You get Nigerian, you get Chinese, you get all these different people, and everybody worship in their own ways. And it just motivates the others.
And how do we be more aware as Canadians of the spiritual needs?
I think when you get into those places, to me, the spiritual need for Canadians is that when we join with these people and we see their culture, we see the way they worship, you know, it's contagious. You want to do the same thing they do. And it motivates other Canadians who are in the church to worship the way they do.
Ray, it reminds me of the story you told of your grandfather, that spiritual conversation needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting because, you know, we talk about immigrations, and of course there's immigration and there's refugees, those who come by choice and those who are displaced. And often immigration, you will find people coming to people who are like them, whereas refugees often are sponsored by faith communities that are unlike them.
Yes.
And so but it's most interesting that refugees that are sponsored by private organizations and primarily faith communities, well, in year one, they may not do as well as government refugees. 5 and 10 years later, they are much better integrated. And I'm not just speaking about their spiritual lives, I'm talking about their economic lives, their engagement in the community. There are many studies out there that show that integration into a faith community helps every dimension of life and citizenship.
All right. Well, what a great look at the power of the immigration and the care of the whole refugee needs that are here in Canada. Thank you very much, Pastor Jeeva Sam, Derek Ramkissoon. Thank you for all your volunteer work, and Ray Pennings from Cardis. Thank you for founding a great think tank that helps us grapple with what it means to bring Christian faith into all of Canada.